brave the rain and everything for our program. R is for railroads. Thank you for supporting us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, which means we get by on little money. So if you could make a donation, a small donation to keep programs like this coming, we would be grateful and appreciative of that. We have some great programs coming up the next month. Check our calendar, visit our website, www.oconeeheritagecenter.org, or ask me or Leslie, and we will be glad to give you information on the upcoming events. This is a real treat tonight. I have been looking forward to our all year long, and we found the perfect person. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Roger Grant. He is the Catherine and Calhoun Lemon Professor of History at Clemson University, and he is also the author of more than 30 academic books, including his recently published Railroads and the American People and the Louisville, Cincinnati, Charleston Railroad, Dreams of Linking the North and South. Let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Roger Grant.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I want to thank the staff here for making this speaking opportunity possible. R is for railroads, and in my book, R is indeed for railroads. Let me just say a few words about why I became a railroad/transportation historian. I'm convinced that small children like things that are large and that move. And we know that Thomas the Tank Engine is a popular PBS program, and this does carry over. Also, small children like dinosaurs, and we know about Barney and Barney's friends. I no longer like dinosaurs, but somehow the railroad gene, the railroad interests never left. Although in college and in graduate school, I did not openly participate in numerous rail enthusiast, rail fan activities. And in fact, my first book, which was my doctoral dissertation, was on life and fire insurance reform during the Progressive era. It's a real page-turner. I was proud of my late mother. I noticed that she had read the first 4 chapters of the book, and that made me feel quite proud. But then I more or less came out of the closet after several other non-railroad books. I discovered that people not only buy the books, which is good, but also they read them and they make comments. And my first major railroad book was a history of a 1,500-mile Midwestern carrier, the Chicago Great Western, Corn Belt route. And perhaps the best letter I ever received, this is before emails really, came from a woman in Owine, Iowa, which was the operational hub of the Great Western. And she pointed out that her husband was dying of cancer in a local hospital, and that every day she read 10 to 15 minutes from the Corn Belt book, and said that he just came alive. And I thought, if I added happiness to somebody in their final days, certainly the final months, that was a real positive as far as I was concerned. Well, I would argue that if you study railroad or transportation history, it's a good way to understand American history, because transportation affects all of our lives, past, present, and future. And the railway age certainly has been with us for more than 175 years. And this evening, I would like to focus your attention on railroads in the upstate. Now, needless to say, we talk about railroads in the South or the Southeast, or even in the state of South Carolina. It's long and complicated. And we could make the same argument for talking about railroads in the upstate counties. But I want to give you a kind of overview of the railroad heritage, to look at the companies and why they were built or weren't built, and also to say something about the social history of railroads, about the importance of the railroad depot in a community's life. In fact, as was mentioned, one of my recent books is a social history of American railroads, railroads and the American people, and I find that this was a book that interested a lot of people, and by getting reviews in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, didn't help sales at all. Well, South Carolina is a state that we may not think of as being in the vanguard of much of anything, but certainly when it came to transportation, railroads, it was. The first bona fide railroad, steam-powered in the United States, was the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. This is rather fuzzy, but it gives you an idea of the primitive nature of railroads. In the 1830s and 1840s, we have the so-called demonstration period. We weren't quite sure what railroads were going to look like. We find some railroads, including the South Carolina Railroad, that was a shortened common name, was built on stilts for a considerable distance. In fact, a railroad in New England also decided that that was the way to go. But then it was decided it was too expensive to maintain, so let's just build a graded right-of-way. So on Christmas Day, 1830, we find the first steam-powered passenger train in the United States. And oftentimes in textbooks and in other publications, we are told that the Baltimore, Ohio was really the pioneer railroad. Well, in some ways it was, but it was using animal power, whereas the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company used steam. And note that name, South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. When it got its charter in the late 1820s, railroads were primitive. They are just starting to emerge. Great Britain in 1825, 1826, 1827. So it was thought if you had this charter and the railroad didn't work out, you could still build a canal. And there were numerous canal projects in the Palmetto State. In fact, the Santee Canal was one of the most important in the South. And in fact, before the railway age in this state, there was considerable interest in improving navigable streams, or to make them that. Perhaps not always for steamboats, but for flatboats and keel boats. Well, this railroad, within a few years, 1833, becomes the longest railroad in the world under a single management. So it goes 136 miles from Charleston. Although the railroad began at the city line, there was fear that if the railroad operated down to the docks, those steam locomotives would cause a major conflict around the town would burn down. It later did have some serious problems with fire. So it goes from Line Road to Hamburg, a community that no longer exists, which is opposite Augusta, Georgia. So the railroad really was admired by outsiders. British visitors thought that the South Carolinians had pulled off a major transportation coup. So we're thinking big, and we started to think really big in 1835, 1836. This is the time when the longest railroad in the world was being projected. It's the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Charleston. And if you want to read all the exciting details, copies are available afterwards, at the author's discount, of course. This was a proposed railroad from Charleston to Cincinnati, and also later to Louisville. The reason for this railroad, which would have been about 700 miles long, involved Charleston's desire to compete more effectively with its rival port city, Savannah, and also, much like New York City had done with the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825, to control the interior, to get the various agricultural commodities and mineral commodities passing through Charleston, and then the various manufactured goods, whether it would be brass from Waterbury, Connecticut, or furniture from London, to go through the port of Charleston. The same feeling that Charlestonians have today in terms of the state docks, the state port. So it was going to be built from Charleston, probably to Knoxville, and then to Cincinnati, and also with a branch to Louisville. Now this map, which dates from 1835, shows a road that was proposed by Cincinnatians, some of whom were closely affiliated with the power elite in Charleston. So Cincinnati was wanting to have a more direct route to the Atlantic rather than to go down the Ohio River and the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans. So there was much discussion, and this led to the largest railroad convention held in American history. It was in Knoxville in 1836. And that's the reason that I got involved with the LC&C. The recently retired CEO of Norfolk Southern, Wick Moorman, for some reason thought a book should be written about the Knoxville Convention. And since they made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, it was done, although in an expanded form. And railroad conventions were commonplace before the Civil War. And even before the railroad era, various promoters of canal schemes like the Erie Canal or the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Buckeye State had conventions. And the idea was sort of like a pep rally or like a political convention to get people energized to go out and promote a particular project. Well, the LC&C was, as I just said, designed to enhance the economic status of Charleston. And poor Charleston, it had been one of the leading colonial communities, but by 1820, the place had slipped into poverty. Not that grass was growing on King and Queen streets, but population was decreasing, and there was a real desire that we better sort of expand or expire. Like all railroad projects in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, we have the spark plugs. And in this case, it was Robert Hayne, who was a U.S. Senator and governor, and he was the one in 1831 that resigned from the Senate, so his friend at that time, John C. Calhoun, could go to the Senate after he had resigned from the vice presidency. Later, Hayne would be the first intendant, that's the common word at the time for mayor, of Charleston. So he was politically connected, he was brilliant, he was a wonderful speaker, and he was really the architect of this Atlantic Ocean to Ohio River scheme. But even though the delegates were energized as a result of this gathering, which took place on the most patriotic day of the calendar, 4th of July, 1836, the project really fizzled. Only about 10% of this railroad, the LC&C, would be built, and that would be from the South Carolina Railroad or the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company at Branchville up to the state capitol in Columbia. And why did it fall apart? It seemed like a great idea, and it was feasibly possible. There would be the use of some inclined planes because steam locomotives were not particularly powerful and couldn't manage heavy grades. And that would increase the cost and certainly make traffic somewhat slower. But it could be done, and by the end of the 1830s, we had many more powerful locomotives, the ubiquitous American Standard 440 that Baldwin and other companies were introducing and perfecting. But a perfect storm occurs for the LC&C. One is that Hayne dies suddenly in 1838, and that certainly hurts. There's also a panic that hits the United States in 1837, and even though it was somewhat slow in arriving in this part of the country, it certainly made foreign investors very leery of putting any money into not so proven railroad projects. Also, there is opposition from John C. Calhoun. This is the portrait that you see in the Clemson University Library. I always thought maybe he had heartburn. I'm not quite sure why this pose, but it is a classic pose. He apparently is not suffering from heartburn. He got malaria and died. Now, Calhoun, not one of my personal heroes, was a real pain in the side of the advocates of this early railroad that certainly would have gone through, sliced through the upstate. Calhoun did not like the general survey that had been done, even though, incidentally, when he was Secretary of War in the 1820s, he was instrumental in the passage of the General Survey Act of 1824 that allowed West Point graduates who were in the Army to work for road projects, turnpikes, canals, and then later railroads, do the survey work, and it was done free. The government picked up the tab. But what Calhoun wanted was a railroad that would go north from Hamburg, South Carolina, through Fort Hill, his plantation, or close to Fort Hill, and then angle over towards the Little Tennessee River through Carolina Gap, which is east of Highlands, not that far really from Cashiers. So it was really self-serving. He traveled a great deal as a U.S. Senator and realized that, goodness, in the winter of 1831, 1832, it rained and rained and rained, and the roads were, maybe 2 or 3 feet deep in mud, and he was trapped. And it was a difficult task to get to the nation's capital from Fort Hill. Also, with his son-in-law, Thomas Green Clemson, they were involved in mining activities, gold mines at Dahlonega, Georgia, and it was assumed that there would be a branch from this LC&C that would go to Dahlonega. So, needless to say, Calhoun tried to derail it, and in fact, he did. So, you do have the death of the great advocate, you have an economic downturn, a depression. We don't like to use that word anymore, we just call them major recessions or whatever. Depression is just too depressing. And then we had the opposition from Calhoun. But the point was that the state capital would be reached, and one of the financial arms of this project was the Southwestern Railroad Bank, which made money for the state and would be used to help finance other railroads. Now, in this period from 1842, when the 10% of the LC&C was completed, until the Civil War, 1861, South Carolina goes on a railroad building binge, more so really than most states east of the Mississippi River, at least in terms of per capita population and square mileage. So there would be a number of railroads that would be constructed. One of the most important in the upstate would be the Greenville and Columbia that opened in the mid-1850s. Also the Spartanburg and Union that ran over part of the Greenville and Columbia. And then south of Lawrence, it veered off to Union and also to Spartanburg. And we also have the so-called Blue Ridge and Pendleton Railroad projects. What I'm trying to say is that South Carolinians realized that they were going to get their cotton to market. They just had to have better transportation. Roads were not good, obviously, and the waterways were temperamental. Sometimes there was too much water, sometimes there wasn't enough. And railroads ran throughout the year, and you could depend upon them, even though the costs would probably be more expensive, but you would not have to pay as much for transportation insurance if you used the rails. So we do find in 1852 in this area the formation of the Pendleton Railroad, which was going to meet a branch in Andersonville, that was its name at the time, from Belton, which was on the Greenville and Columbia. And it was going to build to Pendleton, 13 miles. And there was a convention in Andersonville, just like we had in Knoxville, but obviously fewer people in attendance, and people were all excited. And at this time, the state would buy bonds and stock, and also various cities. In fact, Charleston paid, by 1860, probably more than $4 million in various railroad projects. So to get to the point, the Pendleton Railroad would be built. It takes a while. It reaches Pendleton in 1858, and in conjunction with that project, which in some ways was directly related to this Blue Ridge Railroad, which was also organized in 1852, it was assumed that the Blue Ridge would pick up at Pendleton, and then would likely go through Raven Gap to connect with the Little Tennessee River and the Tennessee River system. But needless to say, that's a long and involved story, and we could be here very late in the evening, past some people's bedtime, talking about all of the ups and downs. It's mostly downs. Here was a railroad company that just had rotten luck. For example, the various contractors, the first contractor was clearly involved in illicit activities. The second contractor, much the same, and the third contractor wanted cash on the barrelhead. So by 1858, the state was absolutely disgusted with what was happening with the Blue Ridge. And so, to make a long story short, the state said, you're just going to have to terminate here in Walhalla, and we'll perhaps continue this project. And that's what happened. So in 1860, the Iron Horse appears in Walhalla. But the Civil War comes along, and we find that here is a railroad scheme that refuses to die. It's not like a cat, it has multiple lives. In 1871, an advisor to the corporate shell of the Blue Ridge decided that what we needed to do to save money, you've got a partially completed Stumphouse Tunnel, for example, but to save money, let's build a narrow gauge line that will go from Walhalla and make connections to Knoxville, Tennessee. It's about 160 miles altogether. And there was this narrow gauge craze in the 1870s. There was the feeling that if you had a limited gauge, in other words, a 3-foot gauge, rather than the Southern Standard gauge, which is 5 feet, rather than 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Pretty exciting. That you would save money. The tear weight for the equipment would be less. The grading would be less expensive. The width of the cross ties would not be as wide, and so on. Well, an economic historian a number of years ago pointed out this was just crazy. It really wouldn't save any money. And since most of the railroads in the United States are either standard gauge or that 5-foot gauge, you would have to transship materials. It's not bad for passenger. You can walk from one gauge car to another. But you can imagine about the freight, it's going to be labor intensive to move, to break bulk, let's say here in Walhalla, because the Blue Ridge Railroad was at a 5-foot gauge. So it seemed to attract some interest, And there was an effort actually to resume grading. And in the interim, the states of Tennessee and Georgia had spent additional funds on trying to complete that original 1850s Blue Ridge scheme. It gets even more complicated. But the upshot is, the Blue Ridge Railroad goes bankrupt in 1873. We have a national depression, and the project really stalls. But would you believe that as late as 1923, there were promoters of completing the Blue Ridge Railroad, and they were based in Anderson. Anderson businessmen said that, quote, to tap a region between Walhalla and Knoxville, which is exceedingly rich in mineral deposits, including big quantities of some of the finest marble in the world, mountains of marble of it, should be built immediately. And so in 1923, a delegation went to the Southern Railway headquarters in Washington, D.C., and were politely dismissed. Certainly by that time, the railway building age had finished. What the Southern Railway, which appears as a result of an amalgamation of several carriers, including the railroad that was built through Seneca, the Atlanta and Richmond Airline Railroad, and then its subsequent Atlanta and Charlotte Airline Railroad. Do you know what airline means? Any idea? Oh, yeah.
Isn't it the air brakes that they put
No,
on?
no. That's a good guess, though. Get some credit. You're thinking. Airline means a direct route. In other words, sort of as the crow flies. And one of the great stories, this is obviously a sidebar, in the wild days of the mid-1920s, when there was an enormous amount of speculation on Wall Street, all of a sudden, 1926, shares of the Seaboard airline company were picked up because people thought that as a result of the Kelly Act in 1825, which really makes commercial aviation possible, profitable, that they bought it. They obviously hadn't done any work to figure out what it was. They were buying a railroad, the Seaboard Airline Railroad. You should have seen the word railroad somewhere, but they saw airline and they thought, wow, 100 shares please, maybe 500 shares. Now they really did the right thing in the sense that the Seaboard Airline did weather the Great Depression, whereas almost all those early airlines, like Universal and so forth, went belly up. So they just got lucky. But an airline was commonly used in corporate names in the period from about the 1850s to the 1880s. So here we have a story of the Southern Railway having other strategies. Now there will be a variety of short lines that are built along the projected route of the LCNC. And that route was, for the most part, through the French Broad River Valley. Incidentally, this is a map that was discovered just a few years ago. It's in the South Carolina Archives and History Commission collection in Columbia. It shows, this is 1836, shows various routes that were proposed to reach the French Broad. And if you are familiar with river geography, the French Broad and the Holston River meet near Knoxville to form the Tennessee River. And darn it, the Tennessee River really doesn't go the right direction. If it had veered off, as God should have placed it, to Mobile and Mobile Bay, it would have been wonderful. But instead, it goes up to Paducah, paralleling the Cumberland River, which also goes into the Ohio River. So if you're using a steamboat on the Tennessee River, you're going to go north rather than to the south or the southwest. It just doesn't seem fair. Well, there were various proposals, including one clearly in the western part of the upstate. And what was generally agreed upon by West Point engineers was to use roughly the route of US 25 north of Greenville, and then to tap the Green River, which flows into the French Broad. And by the 1880s, a railroad will connect Spartanburg with Asheville. It is completed in 1886, and it will then connect with two smaller railroads that go from Asheville to Knoxville. So if you ever go through Hot Springs, it was originally called Warm Springs, but Hot Springs, North Carolina, is on the French Broad, and this would be a route that was promoted in 1836 to 1842. So what we have here is, as I said, a map that shows what might be possible. Now, in time, the dominant railroad in the upstate is clearly the Southern Railway, which makes its debut in 1894, thanks to J.P. Morgan Sr. And this is a time of system building when we're taking these short lines or small regional carriers and merging them into a major interstate rail system. And the Southern Railway has a rather complicated corporate history, but to get to the point, the Southern Railway really dominates our part of South Carolina. Now, another railroad that did have an important presence would be affiliated with the Atlantic Coastline, and that would be the Charleston and Western Carolina, going from Port Royal to McCormick, and then with a line that goes up to Anderson, and then a line to Spartanburg. Now, one, I think, rather interesting thing about South Carolina is that it's like other southern states, and maybe you could argue almost all states, in that it had a plethora of short lines. Perhaps the most popular rail fan book ever written was by Lucius Beebe. It's called Mixed Train Daily. Lucius Beebe and his partner went into the Southlands. In fact, they went throughout the country, but they fell in love with all these short lines, particularly those in Georgia and northwestern Florida. But if you just think about it, some of these short lines in South Carolina had a relatively long life. Look at the Pickens Railroad, which opened in the late 1890s and just closed down in the very recent past. You also have the Ware Shoals Railroad, you have the Due West Railroad, there are several others as well. But we don't have that kind of density. In other words, the railroad map of South Carolina does not look like a plate of wet spaghetti. If you look at a railroad map of Iowa or Illinois or Ohio, even East Texas, for example, there are lines here, there, and everywhere. But remember, this is in an era of horses and buggies and wagons. Roads were atrocious, and railroads were the magic carpets. If you wanted to go from point A to point B and actually get there in a reasonable length of time. Now, South Carolina, and in our area, really was not a part of the electric interurban era that bursts upon the scene after 1895. These are, some people would say, trolleys that ran between cities, hence the name interurban. The modern electric trolley made its debut in Richmond in 1888. And the first interurban, a true interurban, as opposed to kind of a rural trolley that wandered out into the countryside, would be in northeastern Ohio, the Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland, the ABC route. So in South Carolina, though, arguably the most profitable of all electric interurbans. When you say the most, it's just like saying the first. You have to be careful because there's always somebody or some group that points out that, hey, you're wrong. But this is the Piedmont and Northern, which was owned by the Duke family. And it's a kind of goofy railroad, interurban, in the sense that it had two parts. It lacked a middle. The North Carolina part went from Charlotte to Gastonia, which major industrial community, textile community. And then the South Carolina division, as it was called, went from Spartanburg to Greenville, down to Belton, to Anderson, and then down to Greenwood. And the company, which opened in 1913, argued that it had a mill every mile. An exaggeration, but there was a great deal of freight service. Passenger service wasn't all that important, and within a short period of time, the Good Roads movement came first to North Carolina, then to South Carolina, and the Model T and other sturdy automobiles of the early 1920s really cut into the passenger business. But it was profitable, and that explains in time why it will eventually fall into the hands of the chassis system, CSX, today. So the short lines and the interurbans are a part of the story, and bringing some to the present, the merger madness of the 1960s, when so many railroads got married because in part they needed to, the economies associated with dieselization had run their course, and government regulation was overwhelming. Talk about enterprise denied. Now that will change in 1980 when the railroad industry is largely deregulated as a result of the Staggers Act, although there's a movement today towards re-regulation, which does not make railroad executives happy. However, as a result of deregulation, railroads are spinning off pieces of property. And so in the upstate, we find the Pickens Railroad just sort of moves. It goes from Pickens down to Anderson, taking over trackage that was once owned by the Southern Railway, Norfolk Southern, which comes into being in 1982, and also some remnants of that Atlantic coastline that came up from McCormick. So here we have another short line, a new short line. And then we find that a portion of the Piedmont and Northern from the Belton area is now the Greenville and Western. So maybe history has kind of run full circle in terms of railroads in the upstate. In other words, we started out with short railroads. We started to see that system building after the Civil War. There's not much change. This is the 1928 map. But then in the post-World War II period, lines are being abandoned, although not to the extent that they are in some states, but also we see the rise of these new independent short lines that can really be consumer-oriented. The big carriers like CSX, Norfolk Southern are interested in the long haul. They are not interested in single box cars or what they call loose car shipments. So if you want to get a box car of potatoes, they'll suggest, why don't you try a trucking company? You don't want to deal with the cost of switching and so on and so forth. Now, clearly, the railroads have this important human dimension. I think that's one reason people like railroads. It's not just for the technology, it's steam locomotives, perhaps the most beautiful piece of equipment man, woman ever made. But you're talking about people. And if we got into our time machine, and I'm always looking for one, if we went back 100 years, we would find that there are so many people, even in this community and in this county and in this immediate area, that had a railroad connection. Maybe somebody worked on the section gang. Maybe somebody was in train service. Maybe somebody was a station agent. And railroads employed literally millions by the time of the First World War. Today, it's only several hundred thousand, although still an important employer in some communities. So the railroad was your gateway to the outside world. And the depot was the center of community life. This is where the freight was coming through, whether it was carload freight or what they call less than carload freight. And before the post office got involved with carrying packages, that comes in 1913 with the Parcel Post Act, you have the various companies like American Express and United States Express and Wells Fargo and Adams. And on the Southern Railway, they had their own express company, the Southern Express Agency. So this is where you get that a Christmas package from Aunt Edith, who lives in Roanoke. It comes through the depot. Also, the ticket agent, the station agent, would plan your itinerary. You'd pick up a timetable or two, and he'd probably explain the difference between AM and PM if you weren't quite sure about that. And he also would send and receive telegrams, and that's the way people were communicating. Usually they were death messages. You didn't just sort of send a telegram like you send a text message today. You know, it was something really important. You know, it's like Uncle Joe is about ready to pass, die, whatever, and you need to come immediately. And the poor agents oftentimes resented the fact that if they delivered a message, they didn't get paid. And people, they got a death message or something, they're going to give a tip or pay the person, the agent. But if you were sending it, the person got 10% of the cost. That was a standard rule for decades, really. But also, people in a community like Walhalla wanted to make sure that the depot made a good impression. I mean, after all, look at all the money that is being poured into airports and airport renovation. You know, GSP undergoing $150 million renovation, and we want people, you know, step off the plane in Greenville, Spartanburg, in Greer, to think, wow, look, a bunch of light wires here. This is really up to date. You know, wow, this is a film. Great. If you step off a plane in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, you think, yikes, I don't think the smart money is coming to Harrisburg, so they're not my money. It's a rather decrepit airport, for example. So there's a lot of difficulty between communities and railroads. Now, railroads have enormous fixed costs, and people in the community often fuss about the depot. Maybe there is no room for a ladies' waiting room, and in the South, as a result of Jim Crow laws, you have the colored waiting room. Sometimes it didn't exist at all; you had to stay outside, people of color. And then you had the men's waiting room, and then the women and children's waiting room, because you wanted to segregate those men who probably chewed, spit, and told off-colored stories or jokes or whatever. You wanted to protect women and children. And sometimes the combinations left a lot to be desired. And also, too, if you really didn't segregate the sexes, you do segregate by race, you've got the loafers who hang out at the depot. Sometimes even teenagers. I'm not sure where teenagers hang out today, but 100 years ago, they could be found at the depot likely. And of course, one advantage of having these loafers and these hangers-on at the depot is that these people got the freshest gossip. This was the good stuff. Much better than probably what you could get on the courthouse steps or a park. You got to know what was happening in the world, because the railroad agent is also not only sending messages for his particular company about train movements, for example, but also is working for Western Union or Postal Telegraph, the two large telegraph companies, although Western Union is much, much larger than Postal. So the depot was an exciting place to be. And people here in Walhalla had the original depot, which probably dated back to post-Civil War. I'm not sure when you could tell me when the first depot was built. But by the early part of the 20th century, residents of Walhalla were not happy. And I discovered this while I was going through the minute books in the Norfolk Southern Archive in Tucker, Georgia. In February 1910, the president of the Blue Ridge Railroad, even though it was controlled by the Southern Railway, was still an independent firm and would remain more or less independent as such until 1921, reported to his board of directors, quote, "The matter has been put off from time to time, but in June 1909, the citizens of Walhalla insisted that they should be provided with a replacement depot. And the citizens petition went on to say that if you don't replace this depot ASAP, we're going to go to the South Carolina Railroad Commission. Now, I'm not saying that the South Carolina Railroad Commission was not somehow controlled by the parties it was designed to regulate, but it could result in some directive that the Blue Ridge Railroad didn't want. Now, the Blue Ridge Railroad is not a money machine. The Southern Railway has it largely to keep anybody else from having it, although there was some local traffic, needless to say. In fact, I might just note that the Southern Railway, in order to get into this part of the United States, was much more interested in controlling short lines in Georgia, like the Gainesville Midland, the Tallulah Falls Railroad that was completed to Franklin from Cornelia, Georgia in 1907. And before that, the Northeastern Railroad Company of Georgia. Boring, boring, boring. But the officials in Washington, the corporate headquarters, much more interested in developing railroads that connected to their other lines that ran through the so-called Knoxville gateway. So poor Walhalla, at the end of a 42-mile line, hardly a significant railroad. The mileage does differ. It's actually measured from Belton to Walhalla. So 42 miles. Yes.
On the Walhalla station, when did the station actually appear in Walhalla versus West Union?
I'm not sure, but I will say this.
And are they talking about
Yeah.
West Union when
Yeah.
they're saying Walhalla?
Yeah, they're saying Walhalla. But anyway, I found in the board minutes that after, quote, careful investigating the matter, authorization came for a new depot at a cost of not exceeding $1,500. So the point is that this has a happy ending. In other words, apparently residents of Walhalla were satisfied. There's no evidence in the minute book, which goes to 1921, that they fussed anymore. And I think the Blue Ridge Railroad executives were happy to have this done with. What we do see, though, is that early on, like with the LCNC, and maybe we could use the example of the Atlanta and Richmond, or the Atlanta and Charlotte airline, that there really is a love relationship. You've got to have a railroad. And so many communities wanted more than one railroad. You know, you're really not big league unless you had 2 railroads, and 3 would be nice, 4 would be even better. This is great. Boosters just love that. So there is generally that love relationship, but then in time it does turn sour. There are complaints about depots. There are complaints about rates, of course, complaints about service. I was looking earlier today at my run of official guides. This is sort of the railroad Bible in terms of timetables. And picked one for 1911, and service to Walhalla really wasn't too bad. There were 2 daily passenger trains to and from Walhalla, and they operated on Sunday. Many railroads were double daily service except Sunday, so there was Sunday service to Walhalla. Isn't that great? Also, there were 2 mixed trains. Anybody know what a mixed train is? Freight and passenger, you know, sort of passengers and hogs together. You know, it's one of those situations where a passenger coach or even a caboose is tacked onto a freight train, and it could take a long time. Now, there are published timetables for these mixed trains for the Blue Ridge Railroad, but something tells me they have a lot of switching to do in Seneca. They're just not going to get out of town when they're supposed to, at least according to the timetable. So Walhalla really wasn't that bad off, and I think up until World War II, there was passenger service here. The Southern Railway operated a gas-electric car or a diesel-electric car. Obviously not all that busy. So we do find this movement towards love to maybe hate, or at least some unhappiness. And that explains why we find state regulatory laws being passed in the 1870s onward, and also federal laws, including the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. And then government gets carried away in the early 20th century with the Hepburn and the Mann-Elkins Act. It goes from sort of bad for the railroads to really bad. And here in South Carolina, the State Railroad Commission is not particularly strong, but at least it exists, and we can thank Pitchfork Van Tillman, one of his many accomplishments as governor. Now, I may just note that I'm somewhat annoyed about cleansing the past. Governor Tillman was arguably maybe the best governor the state ever had. Not only railroad regulation, but controlling the phosphate trust, tax reform, higher education, Winthrop and Clemson, goes on and on. But I'm not going to be preachy about that. I think we would all agree that America has seen a sea change in terms of the passenger and the railroad, although in our own lifetime there has been a resurgence of interest, in part because the freight railroads dumped their passenger trains and let Uncle Sam have what we would call lemon socialism. The private sector didn't want it, so Amtrak makes its appearance in 1971, and I think we realize today that there is interest in high-speed rail, or at least higher-speed rail, and perhaps if you do have rail service, you would like to have more than one train a day. Sometimes these trains arrive in the middle of the night, which is great for insomniacs, but it's not great for the typical patron. The rule of thumb is that you really need 3 trains each way to serve passenger needs. So even though South Carolina was in the driver's seat, bad metaphor, in the vanguard of the railway age and the railroad revolution, we seem to be kind of slow in terms of thinking about how we might have high-speed train service between the Charlotte and Atlanta terminals. Although just recently, the Greenville News talked about the possibility of having passenger service between Greenville and Charleston. So who knows? That's one of the exciting things about railroad history, is that it really doesn't change. I think we'll have railroads for generations yet unborn, but there have been sort of these watershed events. The construction, the regulation, and sort of the deconstruction of the railroad network. So we still have quite a few rail lines here in the upstate, and I doubt if we'll see any more railroad abandonments. And if a big company like CSX or Norfolk Southern wants to dispose of a secondary line, for example, from Seneca to Anderson, I'm sure the Pickens Railroad, or perhaps even the Greenville and Western, or some new short line operator will take it over. This recently happened in the Hendersonville area, where Norfolk Southern leased, essentially, its line that went to the west and to the southwest from Asheville to the Blue Ridge North Railroad. I believe that is the name. Well, I've talked way too long, and do you have any questions or any thoughts? Not that I'm the answer guy. Obviously, I don't know about West Union depots and Walhalla depots, other than I thought that was kind of interesting that the Blue Ridge Railroad got out of this mess by paying only $1,500. I'm sure if we adjust it for inflation, it's not insignificant. But people wanted good depots, just like they wanted good rail service. Yeah.
This one you should be able to answer, Dave. It's not about depots. Southern, in a lot of old newspapers I've read from the teens, 1880s, before it was Southern, talked about they were double-tracked from Charlotte to Atlanta. Of course, we are no longer double-tracked. And I have heard a story as to why we're no longer double-tracked, and I would like...
Well, I think there are several reasons.
I heard it was taxation.
Well, that's one factor, but also with the development of centralized traffic control, CTC, you can have almost the same capacity on a single line as you had on a double-track line. Although Norfolk Southern has been redouble tracking lines in North Carolina, pretty well finished with that. Just as the interstate highway system is adding a third lane in various parts of the region. So if capacity continues to be a problem, although Norfolk Southern has certainly been hurt by the downturn in metallurgical coal traffic, but container traffic, intermodal traffic is on the rise. And I wouldn't be surprised that we might see double tracking in this area once more. I mean, a lot of the superstructure is available.
Was it pulled up due to the government beginning to tax by mile of rail versus mile of track?
Well, it would be the county governments that would do the taxing.
That's what I had heard, that, you know, that there were double tracks across the trestle at Clemson. I mean, it was double tracked all the way, and that they pulled it up when the government basically doubled their
But
taxes.
remember, this is occurring at a time when traffic is declining, feeling the sting of highway competition. So who knows? Things that we think are gone forever might return. And that's why we have rail banking, rails to trails, that there have been some abandoned lines that have actually been rebuilt. A major line in Washington State, for example, has been rebuilt because of capacity issues. But who knows about the future? I just live in the past. Sort of in the present, too.
Is Amtrak the only passenger train now?
Well, that's the largest one. They have contracts with various commuter authorities and so on. But yes, it's essentially the one and only. There are no freight railroads that have passenger service. At the time Amtrak was created, there were 3 railroads that retained their passenger service: Rock Island, Denver Rail Grand Western, and the Southern. The Denver Rail Grand Western and the Southern wanted to maintain quality. Rock Island was so poor, eventually it will fail and be liquidated. They just couldn't afford to pay the entry fee, even by donating equipment. So, no. You know, there's a debate in Congress about let's privatize the Northeast Corridor and so on. And that's the only piece of trackage that Amtrak owns, and they got it out of the Conrail creation. They collapsed financially at Penn Central. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about rails and textiles and the extent to which the shifts in the textile industry impacted the railroads or vice versa?
Well, I would say that with declining manufacturing, it hurt the railroads, but trucks probably did more damage than anything else with the development in the post-World War II period of much better roads, certainly the coming of the interstate highway system after 1956. Railroads oftentimes would be hauling in the bulk commodities, but the manufactured goods would go by truck. And there really is a lot of sense to that. Railroads are much better at hauling certain commodities over long distances, trucks door to door, door to rail. And then with the whole development of the piggyback, and the Southern Railway embraced that in the 1950s, that this made it possible for a kind of seamless movement from factory to end point, the customer, if you will. Well, you're still awake. Some people have survived 2 Grant lecture experiences today. Okay, you've been a great audience.
Thank you.